It's noon here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Klenn. I'm a communications specialist at AOCS. In today's webinar, Jeffrey Hafer, senior scientist at Canola USA, will discuss how changes to the Toxic Substances Control Act affect regulations of new and existing chemicals. During a 36-year career in industry, Jeff held a variety of positions at Rahm & Haas and Dow Chemical, including Global Regulatory Specialist and Global Product Stewardship Manager for the coatings business. In 2013, he became a corporate TSCA manager for Dow Chemical. After retiring from Dow in 2016, Jeff joined Canola USA as a senior regulatory scientist. During his career, Jeff served as chair of the American Chemistry Council's Regulatory Advocacy and Information Network, the American Coatings Association's Product Stewardship Committee, and the Emulsion Polymers Council. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the chat box on the right side of the screen. We'll have time for Q&A after the presentation. With that, I'd like to say thank you, Jeff, for presenting this webinar and sharing your knowledge with us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see if I can get this to work. All right, here's the agenda. We'll start out talking about new substances and pre-manufacturer notices under TSCA. New substances are those that are not listed on the TSCA inventory or otherwise subject to an exemption, and the pre-manufacturer notice is the process to get them listed. We'll go through the current status, how to navigate the process. We'll talk a bit about consent orders and significant new use rules, since that's a very important tool that the agency is using. And then we'll go into a new chemical category, lung toxicity, and talk about how the agency comes up with these categories. Then we'll switch over to existing chemicals. We'll talk about the CBI issues that have come up with the inventory reset. Then prioritization, risk evaluation, and management. This is how the agency needs to look at the entire inventory of existing chemicals in the next few decades, I suppose. And then what substances are under review right now, a closer look, and then we'll conclude. All regulatory systems include two components: the law, what the legislation intends, and the regulations, how the law is implemented. I think when the revised TSCA, the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, was first published, it didn't really seem to have any radical departures. It was all minor changes. But implementation is always where the rubber meets the road and you find out how regulations are going to work. And nothing could be more true than what happened to the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act. There's a couple of important concepts, 4 of them, but I'm going to focus in on 2 because they're the 2 concepts that have had the biggest impact on how new chemicals are reviewed and treated. First, the agency must regulate if the substance may present unreasonable risk, or there is insufficient information, or substantial production and exposure. And the important thing here is the preposition or. Previously under TSCA, that was and. So the substance had to present an unreasonable risk and have insufficient information. Now, insufficient information in and of itself is enough for the agency to take action, which has been a real game changer. Another concept is conditions of use, circumstances under which a chemical substance is intended, known, or reasonably foreseen to be used. Very important, because the agency decides what's reasonably foreseen. You don't, they do. So what's the current status? The pre-manufacturer notice process remains essentially the same, but some important changes in the potential outcomes to the risk assessment. Under old TSCA, there were 4. A request for upfront testing, which was relatively rare. A risk or exposure-based consent order. This is a binding legal agreement between the US EPA and the submitter of the PMN to do something, to do testing, to have certain personal protective equipment. There's restrictions. There's a legally binding agreement between the submitter and the agency. Then there's the significant new use rule, which extends these conditions to all, any manufacturer, importer, or user, because once the substance goes on the TSCA inventory, anybody can manufacture, import, or use it. And the 4th was drop or drop with a drop letter, which was the desired outcome. It means the agency came to a position during their risk assessment process where they said there's nothing else to look at here, so they dropped your case, and then after 90 days you were free to go. Now there are 3 possible outcomes. Presents an unreasonable risk, then as I mentioned before, information is insufficient, or the substance may present unreasonable risk, or you have substantial production and exposure. And the third is not likely to present an unreasonable risk. If you get an A or B outcome, the agency must regulate. They have no choice. They have to do something. And if it's A, chances are they're going to just ban it altogether and not allow you to proceed. If it's B, originally in the law, they had to issue a consent order and then follow up with a SNR. What the agency is doing now is they are increasingly going directly to SNR, which is a process they used under old TSCA as well, because the consent order / SNR process is extremely lengthy and difficult. And if you can go directly to a SNR, it moves the whole process along. This is contentious and there are lawsuits, but they're actually doing it. And if they find that you're not likely to present unreasonable risk, they have to publish why they think so. Due to these new concepts of insufficient information and reasonably foreseen conditions of use, the outcomes of the PMN process have radically changed. This is a look at PMNs up to the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act. The outcomes greater than 80% were no concern. And then 20% roughly were consent orders or consent orders and SNRs, or the submission was withdrawn, or there was voluntary testing. After Lautenberg, it flips. So now you've got less than 20% getting the not likely to present unreasonable risk finding, and then over 80% getting consent orders with testing or being withdrawn. So you've gone from more than 80 going through and 20 being regulated to more than 80 not going through and being regulated and 20 actually going through, just a complete flip. What's the effect on innovation? Well, one way to look at it is the number of notices of commencement. Notices of commencement are the documents that are submitted to the EPA when you begin your commercial activity after filing a PMN. And you can see that they basically, after Lautenberg, have dropped off a cliff. Now, there are many, many, many reasons why people do not file a notice of commencement. It can be that it just became not commercially viable, that the economics changed, lots of things. But this is such a dramatic shift that it bears watching, and we'll have to see when we get the numbers for 2018 and 2019 to see if this trend continues. But this suggests that 80-20 change is really affecting the number of new chemicals that are coming into commerce. Another statistic I'll share here on the right-hand side in the box are the number of consent orders and the number of tests, either tox or physical property tests that have been required for the consent order. 2015, before Lautenberg. 2016 is a red herring because that's the year that Lautenberg went into effect and the EPA had to reset the entire PMN process. So hundreds of PMNs that were already in process had to go back to day 0. So it's not a viable look. But if you go to 2017, basically you see a 10-fold increase in the number of consent orders and the number of tests to support them. So yeah, there's been a change. That's pretty clear. But again, the process is pretty much the same. At around day 45 of the 90-day process, the agency comes to a conclusion that they may present unreasonable risk or they don't have enough information. And then they contact you and they'll draft an action letter specifying their concerns and the actions they propose to take. These actions could include restrictions on the use, on the volume, could require testing upfront or after, and other limitations. As I mentioned, the consent order SNR process is lengthy and cumbersome. So you have a 90-day statutory time period, which can go on for a lot longer, and some go on for years. So what can you do? Well, you conduct your own risk assessment. The EPA tools are available. The tools they use to do their risk assessment are available on their website. You can use them too. Predict the outcome. Do what they're going to do and see what you come up with. And also prepare for a SNR. If 80% of chemicals are going to get regulated or withdrawn, think about, if you do the risk assessment and you see there's a problem, think about what kind of restrictions can you live with? What might they be, and how would you adjust to them? So the first thing to do is hazard data needed? Start off with the basic physical chemical properties. If they're not already available, run the EpiSuite model. Particularly, they like to see water solubility, vapor pressure. If it's solid, melting point. Octanol water partition coefficient is the basis for all the ecotox evaluations and boiling point. If the model doesn't work, and it doesn't work for polymers or organometallics, or if it provides questionable values, consider conducting the test. If you run the model on your molecule and it comes up with a water solubility that doesn't make any sense based on what you know, then run the test and prove it. And if relevant, if there's inhalation potential, generate particle size or aerosol size distribution. And I'll get into that when we talk about the lung toxicity category. The second, are you already in a chemical category? The document's out there. There are 56 of them, and I mentioned lung toxicity is one of the new ones, so it's 56 and growing. These categories include discrete functionality like aldehydes and amines. It could be groups like cationic polymers or neutral organics, and classifications, PBT substances. The category defines the scope and specifies the test data that is needed. If the substance is not in an existing category and no data is provided in the assessment, then you could still come up with insufficient information. So the categories give you a red flag and say, okay, the EPA is already concerned about your chemistry. If you're not a category, you don't know if they have concern or not, and you won't know till you submit. Also, determine if there's relevant analog data. Here's lots of sources of relevant analog data. Find a molecule that's like yours and see if there's data available. Although, remember, they will expect full studies. So if you find a molecule and you get a robust summary or an endpoint, that'll be useful, it'll inform, but they may not be able to actually incorporate it into the risk assessment unless they can see the study itself. So here's an example of a category, aldehydes. Okay, they give you the definition. What's in this category and why is it a problem? And then they give you the boundaries, the molecular weight boundary, the octanol water partition coefficient boundary. So they define the universe, the sub-universe of aldehydes where they have concern. And if you fall outside that sub-universe, you're probably okay. But if you fall inside that universe, then the next step is recommended testing. This is what the agency is going to want in order to make a decision about your molecule. And it's tiered. You start with the aquatic base set. If you get a good answer there, you stop. If not, you go to biodeg. If you get a good answer there, you stop. If not, you go to chronic testing. So it's very straightforward. If you fall into one of these categories and you meet the boundaries, there's recommended testing. If you have it, that's great. If you don't, you should get it, because if you don't have it, the agency is most likely going to find insufficient information. As I mentioned, exposure can also trigger a different review. Relatively high production volumes of, say, over 100,000 kilograms per year. Anytime you have a consumer exposure, you're going to go into a different review than if you just have an industrial chemical. But there's all these triggers here that, regardless of the hazard, it doesn't, in this case, it doesn't matter what the hazard is. You go into a different review if you trip any of these exposure triggers. So how do you estimate these exposures? EPA tools. ChemSteer is the screening tool for environmental releases from commercial manufacture and commercial use, like window cleaners and things like that. The environmental fate properties are estimated by the EpiSuite, and EFAST estimates consumer general public down the drain type of releases. So that's how you can get your exposures. So if you have a handle on your hazard and you have a handle on the exposures that the EPA is going to generate for your use, you can do the same thing they're going to do and come up with the conclusions they're going to come up with, and you'll know whether or not you're going to have problems. Other potential concerns include endocrine disruption. If you're a nanomaterial, you go into an entirely different process. And if you're biodegradable, the most important thing is, what does it degrade to? How fast? In what media? So these are the things to think about up front. If you Before you go into the new chemical process, think about what's going to happen at the EPA and try and predict it. And the other important thing that we always recommend is schedule a pre-notice meeting with the agency. Have a meeting with them before you submit. Say, this is my molecule, here's my end use, this is the volume I expect, here's the data I have, what do you think? And they'll tell you, they'll give you an idea of, yeah, it looks like you have enough data, you should be okay, or, well, no, we think you should probably get these pieces of data before you submit. It's not a guarantee, but it's better than going in blind. So what happens if it doesn't work? Well, as long as you're not totally unacceptable, you're going to get a consent order or a SNR, or both. And what do these things contain? Well, they could contain requirements for tox testing or environmental fate, either once a certain production volume is reached or a certain time period is reached. Use of specific PPE. They could tell you, you have to use these kind of gloves, you have to use these kind of goggles. New chemical exposure limits. They could give you an exposure limit that you would have to meet. Hazard communication language, what your MSDS says and how it says it. Distribution and use restrictions. A simple one is no consumer use. And if you don't have a consumer use, what do you care? It doesn't matter. But that's an example of a use restriction. And restrictions on releases to water, air, or land. This often takes the form of no release to surface water, which is a very difficult restriction to meet. And then there's record keeping pieces. So it's a good idea to become familiar with the TSCA consent order boilerplate, which is on their website. And the boilerplate is, I liken it to a box of Lego. It's all the pieces that the agency can put together to form a consent order. And if you get used to the pieces, when you get the consent order, it's not so overwhelming because they can be very long. They can be 80, 90 pages long. But if you realize it's just a bunch of stuff they stapled together and you take it apart into the individual pieces, it's not so overwhelming. And then, as I mentioned before, the Section 5E orders are only binding on the PMN submitter. They will follow up with a significant use rule. And these are available on a platform called ChemView. And the nice thing about the SNRs in ChemView is they've been translated from regulation speak into English. So they take it out of regulation language, which is very difficult to read, very clunky, and they just say, this is what you need to do and this is what you can't do. So I highly recommend it, especially if you're not familiar with SNRs, to go read them in ChemView because you can actually read them. All right, let's talk about these categories. Here's a new one. Lung toxicity. And what's interesting about this is most of the categories, like I showed you before, they're chemical. They're aldehydes, they're amines, they're cationic polymers. This is a category reflecting a potential toxic effect, not a specific chemistry. And it's broken down into 4 subcategories: general surfactants, polycationic substances, waterproofing agents, and insoluble polymers. The first 3 all have oxygen transfer as the concern. The insoluble polymers are about overload lung clearance issues. But as like the other categories, they include the definitions, why there's a concern, risk management measures, and tiered testing. So let's look at one. Let's look at general surfactants. So the definition is cationic, anionic, and non-ionic. Now I will mention there already are categories for cationic, anionic, and non-ionic surfactants in the existing document, but they address environmental concerns. Now this category is addressing health concerns, and the concern is impaired lung function. The initial testing is designed to determine the potential for exposure and address other concerns. So the first thing is, as I mentioned, particle size distribution or aerosolized droplet size. If you have an inhalation use, generate this data. If you don't have respirable particles, if you have less than 10% of your distribution is respirable, then you can't cause a problem and you can stop and not be worried about it. If you do have a significant respirable particle population, then for the surfactants, you have to do the capillary surface tension. So if respirable particles are not generated and surface tension decreases are not observed, then you're done. You should have absolutely no concerns. If you trip those concerns, then you move on to the next part of the category. And here are the risk management options. These are ways you can avoid having to do testing if you can control the risk using these mechanisms. The first is a respirator with APF 50, and then meeting the limit of 4 micrograms per cubic meter. Or if you just go all the way to a respirator with an APF of 1,000, there's no limit. You just use a respirator with APF 1,000. Or if you meet the exposure limit that they propose. The problem is a lot of people don't like these equipment. It causes a problem. It's not easy to control. And so if just going directly to this kind of risk management measure doesn't work, the next step is testing. And there's 2 tiers. Tier 1 goes in 3 steps. Acute 403. And if your effect level is less than 2,000, you go to the 5-day. If you have a substantial decrease in point of departure, you go to TG 412. And if that doesn't solve the problem, then you move on to tier 2 with the 90-day inhalation study. And if you have carcinogenic potential, a 2-year inhalation study. And either one of those will probably kill the molecule because they're very expensive and you don't have any guarantee of the outcome. So that's how this category works. And I think we'll see in the future with the EPA, when they come out with new categories, they will tell you what's in scope, why there's a concern, and give you risk management options or testing options to get out of that concern. So it's basically a roadmap. You know, if you fall into these categories, they're telling you what you need to do in order to have a chance of getting through the PMN process. Okay, let's move over to existing chemicals. And the existing inventory included 86,000 substances. So the agency found that indicating which are truly active in commerce will assist in the scope of existing substance evaluation, because again, they have to go through the entire inventory of existing chemicals and do a risk evaluation. So if they can knock down the number, that's helpful. It also provides an opportunity to revisit CBI, and that's happening as part of this process. So in February of this year, they released the updated inventory. There's about 40,000 active. Most of them are public, about 8,000 are confidential. So they did a good job. They knocked down the universe of things they have to be concerned about by more than half. And then in April, they published a pre-publication notice of its rule for CBI claims. So here's where the CBI, and CBI is a big deal under revised TSCA. Reporters who did not provide voluntary substantiation at the time they submitted their Form A for the inventory update, they'll be required to submit it. A potential exemption is available to those who did certain substantiations for CBI claims in another submission in the past 5 years. All substantiations must be done no later than 90 days after the effective date of the final rule. And that final rule is expected by February 19 of next year. And I have a feeling they might come out a little faster than that. So what are these new requirements under revised TSCA? They've got to review all existing CBI within 5 to 7 years. That's a huge, huge job, which is another reason to do the active inactive cut. Non-exempt CBI claims must now be submitted up front with data submissions. So if you make certain CBI claims with a PMN, now you have to substantiate when you send it and not later. They must review all non-exempt claims and 25% of exempt claims. That's a lot. And there's a 10-year expiration date. CBI can also be shared under certain circumstances with state governments, first responders. So what's exempt information? Specific process information, marketing and sales, suppliers and customers. For mixtures, details of the full composition, you wouldn't have to do that. Specific information regarding use, function, and application. Generic information about the use, yes, that's not exempt, but specific information, your specific use is exempt. And specific production or import volumes. You can't claim health and safety studies, CBI, And then, as I mentioned, the generic general information on volumes, process descriptions, or uses. So what is substantiation? What's an example of that? Well, you have to tell them the period of time for which you want it to be confidential, and by default now, 10 years is the maximum. The purpose for which the information was furnished to the EPA in the first place, the measures you've taken to guard against disclosure, and if it's been disclosed, the extent to which the information has been disclosed. So for instance, has the identity of the substance, if you want to claim the identity of the substance confidential, has it been disclosed in the patent? Does it appear on an SDS anywhere in the world? These are things that could invalidate your claim. And harmful effects of disclosure. Why is this a problem? Just wanting to keep it secret is not good enough. They want to know why, if it did get out, what would happen. So I mentioned the maximum is 10 years, and it may be resubstantiated after that expiration date. So the inventory research process, it's not done. The final has not been, the curtain hasn't come down. So if you have something that's inactive and you want to change it to active, it's an NOA, Notice of Activity Form B. You can't submit it any earlier than 90 days before the anticipated date of manufacturing or processing, but it can be as late as the day before. So if you have something that's listed as inactive and you want to import it or manufacture it on May 31st, you can submit Form B as late as May 30th, and it's sufficient. But you can't submit any earlier than 90 days before you expect to initiate the commercial activity. And upon receiving the notice, the EPA will change the designation immediately, and then they'll require CBI substantiation for anything you're claiming confidential within 30 days of the submission. All right, what about the rest of the world of existing chemicals, those 40,000 substances? What's the agency got to do? Well, they've got to do a risk evaluation. It's in 3 steps: prioritization, the actual evaluation itself, and then risk management measures. Prioritization takes the form of dividing it into 2 categories: high priority, where risk assessment is required, and no consideration of cost or non-risk factors can be taken at this point. It's simply a may present unreasonable risk because of hazard and route of exposure, or low priority, where no assessment is required, and they have to have sufficient data to make that determination. Once you have your high priority substances, they move into risk evaluation. If the risk evaluation concludes there's an unreasonable risk, control measures are required, and you move into risk management, where now cost and benefit may be considered. So this is the process: prioritization, risk evaluation, risk management, that the agency is going to have to do for every chemical on the TSCA inventory. Prioritization itself has 3 stages: initiation, proposed designation, both of them subject to a 90-day comment period, and then the final designation. In March of this year, the EPA did the first groups of 20 high and low priority substances, put it out there for the comment. All of the high priority substances are from the 2014 TSCA work plan, but in the future, preference for high priority designation is given to those substances on that work plan, any that have a persistence or bioaccumulation score of 3, and in the footnote I give you what that means, if it's a known carcinogen and has high acute and chronic toxicity. And all on the low priority list come from the US EPA Safer Chemical Ingredients list, and I suspect that will continue until they run out of chemicals on that list. The agency must complete the process in the next 9 to 12 months, and they're really high on making their deadlines these days. So what's the second step? The actual risk evaluation. First of all, the scope. Now they have to include the hazards, the exposures, the condition of use, the potentially exposed sensitive subpopulations such as children and the elderly. And that's considered no later than 6 months after the initiation of the risk evaluation. And then the actual evaluation occurs. They have to tell you whether it's going to be aggregate or sentinel. Is it going to be all the conditions of use, or are they going to take a specific condition of use and focus on that as the worst case? They have to describe the weight of scientific evidence. They can't consider costs or other non-risk factors at this stage. There's a 3-year deadline with one possible 6-month extension. Includes at least one 30-day public comment period. And you can see from this timeline that this is a ponderous process. This is not going to be quick. It's very thorough, but it's anything but fast. And then risk evaluation will be conducted on substances. And these are what I mentioned before. First of all, the 2014 TSCA work plan, P3B3s and CMRs. And the third category are those nominated by industry that meet the criteria. And how that works is anybody can do it, a single manufacturer or a group, but you must have sufficient information under the conditions of use. So you can't say, EPA, we want you to evaluate this chemical and go find data. You have to have everything they need when you come to them. There's no high or low priority designation, no screening. If you have the information and you want to do it, okay. They'll prioritize requests where individual state action may impact interstate commerce. For instance, if California wanted to take action on a chemical and you said, oh, I don't want that to happen, I want the EPA to do their review so they can preempt it, they'll make that a priority. But the kicker is you got to pay for it. If it's a work plan chemical, you pay 50% of the total cost with $1.25 million as the initial payment. If it's not on the work plan, you pay 100% of the total cost with a $2.5 million initial payment. So this ain't trivial, and you might wonder, is anybody going to do this? As a matter of fact, 2 substances have already been nominated. So if it's important enough that you want to get the clean bill of health from the US EPA saying your substance does not pose a risk, you can get that done, assuming you have the information. This process represents a pipeline because every time they finish one high priority substance, they have to designate another one. And they have to designate at least another 20 substances in the next 3.5 years. And I imagine they will meet that and probably more because they're talking about starting to use a group approach rather than individual chemicals. For the final phase, if they do find that you present a risk, they got to propose a risk management rule within 1 year, publish a final rule within an additional year, not extendable for more than 2 years. Whew, you can see how long this is going to take. And then they have to publish a statement concerning the effects and magnitude to the humans and the environment. Now they can look at benefits, reasonably ascertainable economic consequences, the costs and benefits of the one or more alternative regulatory actions that they've considered, and the cost effectiveness of the actions. So now we found unreasonable risk, this is how we want to manage it, and this is why these management conditions are acceptable. It's required in selecting among the prohibitions or other restrictions to factor in these considerations to the extent practicable, as opposed to the least burdensome. This is the huge difference between old TSCA and new TSCA. The standard under the old statute was they had to use the least burdensome option. And that just resulted in large amounts of money going to lawyers. Because, okay, you say that's the least burdensome, but I don't think that's the least burdensome, and I don't think that's the least burdensome, and you have a huge, everything grinds to a halt because everything goes into court. But now it has to be to the extent practicable, which is a much lower bar for them to defend the risk management measures that they propose. So let's look closer at what they're currently looking at. There are 10 substances currently in the process or already completed, and here they are. Dioxane, bromopropane, asbestos, which was finalized in April. Anything that's no longer on the market cannot return without the agency evaluating them and putting in place any necessary restrictions or prohibiting use altogether. Carbon tet, the cyclic aliphatic bromide cluster, which is, I think, the way they're moving in the future to clusters of chemicals instead of individuals. Methylene chloride, final rule was out in March, prohibits use in paint removers for consumer use. So here's a very specific end use. N-methylpyrrolidone, pigment violet 29, tetrachloroethylene, and trichloroethylene. Although the assessments had to be conducted under revised TSCA, they had a running start with these because they'd already been looking at these and they were part of the old TSCA work plan. So that's why I believe these were chosen, because they had the information and they could just push forward under the new criteria. Okay, for existing chemicals, what's up for low priority? Well, here they are. And as I mentioned, these are all from the US EPA Safer Chemical Ingredients list, which is available. I believe that for the low priority chemicals, until they will exhaust this list before they start nominating other things. Because again, whatever they nominate as low priority, they have to have all the information necessary to make that determination. So they have to have all the hazard data and all the use information. So I think, again, they're going to pick the low-hanging fruit here and go for the chemicals that they've already evaluated. Here's the high priority. The list includes 7 chlorinated solvents, 5 phthalates and 1 phthalate precursor, 3 halogenated flame retardants, 2 chemical intermediates, 1 fragrance ingredient, and formaldehyde. And I think formaldehyde is going to be a fascinating risk assessment because of its ubiquitousness in the environment. But this gives you a clue to like what they're thinking of when they think of high priority chemicals for review. So again, it's time to look at your own portfolio and think, do I have any chemicals that are going to fall into this process in the next couple of years? So we looked at new substances and the pre-manufacture notice process, the current status, navigating the process, consent orders and significant new use rules. And again, I can't recommend enough that you get familiar and comfortable with them, because if you aren't affected by them directly with the chemical that you make or import, your suppliers are probably going to be affected in the future. And so everybody's going to have to, I think that historically, I call it the fear of the snur. And I think we have to get over it because they're coming. So we have to live with them. And if we understand them and what they are, I think we can live with them. And then we looked at a new category for lung toxicity, and I think that's, again, the wave of the future of how the EPA is going to roll out new categories, not necessarily based on chemical attributes, but based on effects. And then existing chemicals, the inventory reset, CBI issues that have come up, prioritization, risk evaluation, and management over the next decades, how the EPA is going to review the entire TSCA inventory, and then the substances that are currently under review. So just to reiterate, in the new chemical process, is your substance in a category? If you don't have data, is there analog data available? Do you have the basic physical property data? Is there a potential for significant exposure? Who's going to be exposed? Industrial, commercial, consumer? Where? How many sites? And how often? And are existing risk management measures sufficient to mitigate the concern? The Ppe and Engineering Controls. A big issue with PMN submitted is people will recommend certain personal protective equipment, but their SDS won't reflect that. And the first thing that comes back is the agency says, well, you don't say to use that in your SDS, so we can't assume anybody's going to use it. Is the substance released to the environment? Your process waste. Transport containers are huge. Does it go in drums? Does it go in totes? Does it go in bulk? When they get cleaned out, where does that go? And is it treated prior to release? And if it's treated, what's the efficiency? Where is it treated? Use the EPA models to estimate releases and compare to the concentration of concern based on available data. Again, you have the power to do this. The models are all available. In fact, we're running a workshop in June with Chemical Watch to do just that, go through this whole process with the EPA models. And schedule a pre-notice meeting to discuss potential concerns. I highly recommend that, because even though the agency can't guarantee the outcome, they can at least say, you know, you really don't have enough data here to do what you're intending to do, and we recommend you do this and this. Or they might look at some of the data you already have. They don't want you to send complete studies or anything at this point, but they will take brief summaries and say, well, I'm not sure that's the test you really should have done here. In conclusion, the PMN process is radically different due to the insufficient information and foreseeable uses concepts. So figure out if data is needed and consider all potential uses, not just the one specified in the PMN. It used to be that when you submitted a PMN, your uses were the ones that were considered and not necessarily anything else. Now the EPA absolutely concerns all potential uses. So you may not use it in a way that it could be inhaled, but somebody else might, and that will be folded into your risk assessment. But that's why I also recommend to folks, don't just tell the EPA how your substance is going to be used. If there's limits on it, tell them how it can't be used. If it has a viscosity that's so high that it could never be sprayed, well, then you don't have any inhalation issue. So tell them up front, let them know it cannot possibly be used in this way, and then they won't even go down that road. And envision what a SNR may entail and if you could live with it. If having a restriction that they have to use, workers have to use a certain type of glove, well, okay, that's not really an issue. Consumer use is not allowed. Well, I'm an industrial chemical, I don't care. No release to water. Oh, that might be a problem. Make sure all the substances you manufacture, import, or process are active and CBI protected if it's applicable. Particularly assure the status of proprietary vendor substances. This is an issue that came up a lot in the inventory reset. When somebody, for instance, is getting a raw material from a supplier outside the United States and they keep the identity of the substance proprietary. So there's no way for you to independently evaluate whether or not it's active. And they have to tell you. There's no other way around it. And if they don't know what you're talking about, there's a good chance there might be an issue there. So proprietary vendor substances are the weakest link in that whole process. I think the most difficult thing to address. Monitor the progress of the existing chemical risk evaluation process. Do you have P3B3 substances in your portfolio? Do you have CMRs? If so, chances are maybe not next year, maybe not the year after, maybe not in 5 years, but eventually you're going to fall into that process. So it'd be good to know now, what data do you have, and in your end use, is it such that there could be no concern because there could be no risk, there's limited or no exposure. Be prepared to defend CBI claims. The EPA has to review them now and on a rolling basis. And they're going to come back and they're going to ask you questions. And the whole CBI substantiation process used to be pretty pro forma. There are a couple questions, you fill out some answers, you send it in. Nobody looked at it. Well, now they're going to look at it. So you have to be able to defend the things that you say. What's next? Alternate test methods. There was a webinar a couple weeks ago about alternate test methods for skin sensitization. Under the Lautenberg Act, the EPA is charged with developing all these new alternate test methods to reduce and eliminate animal testing, and they're doing it. So we're all going to have to get comfortable, get to know what they are, and begin to understand how they work. Look for an expanded categories list. The existing categories list was last published in 2010, so it's going to be 10 years old, and there are new categories that haven't been published yet, so it's time for them to republish, and I think they're going to. And then there's the chemical data report coming up next year, and they just put out a proposal for changes to CDR, and some of them aren't trivial. So whatever you did back in 2016, there could be some significant differences that affect you in 2020. So it's a good idea to get up to speed on what they're doing. And that's it. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I will be very happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jeff. Just a reminder to everyone, please type your questions in the chat box. We can give everyone a couple minutes to type anything out.
I think I did see a question about volume for a PMN. At what volume you have to have a PMN? Reply in private. Okay. Well, I can do that. Yes, you can get a copy of the presentation. I have to go back to my company and make sure that they've pulled out anything that they don't want, but that they hardly ever do anything, so yes. Oh, okay. For a PMN, unlike REACH, where there's a 1 metric ton threshold, anything under 1 metric ton you don't have to worry about, and Canada has several different thresholds before you need to do a submission. Under TSCA, 1 gram. There is no threshold whatsoever. There's no volume limit for which you have to report. Now, you can be exempt. You can be under the R&D exemption, where then there's no volume for that either. There is a low volume exemption, which up to 10,000 kilograms per year, which is very useful for people because the low volume exemption has a lower review period. It's only 30 days instead of 90 days. The cost is significantly less. Now a PMN fee is $16,000, and an LVE, I forget what the actual number is, but it's much less than that. So there are advantages if you can live with less than 10,000 kilograms per year. But you have to remember that you don't go on the TSCA inventory. You're the holder of the exemption, and that can be a limitation. And whatever uses you put in that low volume exemption, you're bound to that. You're bound to the way you manufacture it. You're bound to the releases to the environment. So if anything significantly changes, you've got to refile your low volume exemption. So a lot of people find the low volume exemption extremely useful because they deal with a lot of low volume chemical substances, but you have to keep in mind the restrictions that are attached to it. And there's also the polymer exemption, where you don't have to file with the agency at all, but you have to meet the requirements of the polymer exemption, which are significant. So there are lots of ways to avoid the PMN process, but they all come with limitations and they all come with restrictions. The R&D exemption, you are allowed to make and use as much as you need to conduct your R&D activities. So there are some people who have made, they're in a high volume continuous process world, in the petroleum world, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of kilograms of substance under the R&D exemption. But if the activity is purely R&D, and that's the hitch, then you have to understand what the restrictions are for R&D activities. It can't have any commercial use. It can only have R&D use. There actually is no statutory volume limit. It's as much as you need to do what you need to do. And that's rare. Most countries do have a volume limit on R&D.
Well, I don't see any more questions. Jeff, did you get any more?
I did not.
Well then, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you again, Jeff, for presenting.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you, you too.